It is time to find out if Miek is gonna be weak in Marvel Snap, because Miek is gonna be the next card joining the game. And he's a 1/1 after each turn. If you discarded any cards, gain +1 power for each end move. Now, there's a few mechanics that I've come to learn about this card that have definitely influenced my decision making when it comes to picking him up on release or not. We'll get to that in a moment, but we got to talk about some mechanics, counters, deck lists that are brewed up, some DATAMINE combos for this little bug in the future, and of course, the spotlight caches that are right there. So you can either use 3,000 tokens, because this is going to be a Series 4 card release, or you can open up a spotlight cache and try to roll for him. But you also might open Annihilus or Phoenix Force. So Annihilus was just recently nerfed, which sucks, but he is probably the main card for junk decks. So if you just want to dabble in that archetype or play that type of deck, he's kind of a must-have, I would say. So that's a pretty high value card packed into the spotlight cache. And then you got Phoenix Force, who I would equally say creates its own archetype. The kind of destroy movement hybrid has been pretty strong since Phoenix Force has been out. And if anything, it's been getting stronger over time. So I think that's a pretty high value pickup as well. But Phoenix Force was just dropped from Series 5 to 4. So while I really like the cards being packaged here, the overall token value, you could say, is not very strong, because you could spend 6,000 tokens, get Miek and Phoenix Force, and then that's the same price as buying one Series 5. So, I mean, if you don't have those cards, then I'd probably try for it. Those are pretty important cards to have in your collection. But otherwise, you got to just look at your tokens, your resources, your collections. You just got to make that decision on your own end. But is the card going to be strong or not? That's what we got to decide. Well, let me tell you right off the hop, he's only got one variant, so he's not looking too strong here, Miek. Let's see what else you got in the mechanics department. All right, so we're going to quickly gloss over some of these mechanics, and then I have a quick little example that I want to show you, and almost a test, which I'm interested to see if people can actually get the right number. So here we have Miek. Miek must be on the board to gain power from his ability. So it's not like Morbius. That's kind of the equivalent that a lot of people are comparing this card to. Morbius is an ongoing ability that gets +2 power for each card that's discarded, so that by the time he hits the board, he can look back and say, hey, 3 cards were discarded, there's easy 6 power. Whereas Miek is thinking, you got to play me early, then you got to discard the cards, then I'm going to get power. That's essentially how it works. It's kind of in that phase. Another thing that I've been seeing a lot of confusion around, so I'm going to try and clarify it as best I can, is that movement is random, right? So he's at one position, a card is discarded, he's going to move to one of the other 2. He's not going to go back to his same location, and it's only going to occur once per turn. So if you were to play MODOK, for instance, you had 5 cards in your hand, you're going to discard 5 cards. That does not mean that Miek is going to move 5 times. It does mean, however, that Miek is going to get 5 power. So there's a huge burst in power, but the movement synergy isn't quite there. He's going to get that power very quickly, and then he's going to shuffle over to one of the other 2 locations if possible, and then that's going to be the Miek play. Now, on top of that, he does not need to move to get the power. That's very important to note, because if you just happen to fill the other 2 locations, you might be concerned about playing your MODOK or whatever else you got to do and not getting that power burst out of Miek. Well, don't worry, it will work regardless. So you could almost lock in Miek with like a Professor X play and still find ways to increase his power by discarding your cards. Now, one of the mechanics that I find is really going against Miek's viability is that end of game discards will not trigger Miek. It's an end of turn trigger. And as we know, when the game ends, that 6th turn ends, there's essentially an end of game phase that the match enters. And at that point, those end of turn are no longer valid. So with Miek, if there's Dracula on the board, Dracula's going to discard a card at the end of the game, and it's not going to trigger Miek. He won't move, he won't gain power. The same goes for Invisible Woman, MODOK, Hela combos. So I think that's like where a lot of people wanted to go with this card, because why not, right? Usually you discard like 5-6 cards in a turn. Seems like a nice early play to put on the board. it's not going to work. So I actually really don't like Hela with Miek unless you're just trying to do some crazy high rolls by dodging your Hela and then playing her later. Like, I don't think they're going to work all that well together. And lastly, Miek will gain power if your opponent makes you discard a card. It doesn't really matter if you are the one playing the card that discards cards. It just matters how many you're actually discarding from your hand. So let's get to an example to visualize how this might work. All right, I hope you were paying attention to the mechanics because I've tried to incorporate as many as I can into this board state example that we have here. Now, I'm going to explain the board state and the conditions that I am providing, but while I am doing so, try to think about the answer to this question. How much power will Miek have at the end of the game? And just for context, the end of the game is coming up shortly because this is turn 6. So the only card that was presently on the board leading up to this turn 6 was Dracula. I don't know what happened. Maybe both players were AFK. Doesn't really matter. Okay, Dracula was the only card on the board leading into turn 6, and our opponent has priority. And somehow, some way, they have 7 energies. You just got to roll with it, okay, for the sake of the example. Now, the play order is going to be Moon Knight coming out from our opponent first because they have priority, followed up by Silver Samurai. And then we're going to play Miek and then MODOK. And our hand is comprised of 2 swarms. So the question I asked earlier, the question I will ask now, how much power will Miek have at the end of the game? Let us find out right now. So, as you can see, boom, Miek's got 7 power. Let's go, little guy. That's pretty good for a 1-drop. And it all happened in 1 turn. Not too shabby. Of course, the odds were in our favor with our opponent discarding some cards in our hand. Now, I'm going to explain how this came to be. And also, as you can see, he moved from the middle to the right. It was a 50-50. Could have went left, could have went right. He ended up going right. That's how the movement worked in that instance. So how did Miek get to 7 power? Well, let's backtrack really quickly. Our opponent played Moon Knight. That discarded 1 swarm from our hand and put 2 swarms back. So far we're at 2 power for Miek. Then Silver Samurai came out, discarding 1 of our swarms, making 2 come back to our hand, leaving us with 4 swarms in hand. 2 cards discarded up to this point, which means Miek would be at 3 power. Now, he hasn't gained that +2 power yet. It's an end of turn trigger, so it's just kind of preloaded. We just know already that he's going to have 2+ power. Now, what did we do? We played Miek, and then we also played MODOK. MODOK is going to discard those 4 swarms and then put full hand. We're going to have 7 by the end of the game, but that doesn't really matter at this point because those 4 are going to contribute to 4 points of power for Miek, which as totaled is 6 power, and then he's got his 1 base power, so he ends up being a 1/7, and then he shuffles over to the right location. Now, what did not happen is Dracula's end of game discard did not give Miek more power and did not move him once more. Okay, so Dracula essentially did nothing. He got 3 power from that swarm, and that's it. It's also worth noting, even though I put emphasis on the play order of the cards, it didn't really matter. Miek just has to be on the board to get that power prior to the end of the turn. So if he's revealed or not, doesn't matter. He'll be able to recognize in that turn how many cards were discarded from your hand, not your opponent's, and tally up all that power at the end of turn trigger event. All right, so I hope that helped out with explaining how this card is going to work. If you still got questions or confused, let me know in the comments below. I will do my best to help you guys out. But really quickly, let's get back to the pros and cons of Miek. So I think, early play, great amount of power because you want to get this card out early and then you want to discard a whole bunch of cards. And just like you saw in the last example, you could have a big turn where you get like +3 power, +4 power, something like that. The example we just had is a little exaggerated, right? It's not going to happen every game, but you could get to some pretty fun power totals, and it's going to naturally synergize with meta discard lists. Like, you could toss him right in there right now, and he's going to work out pretty well. But where, if I was to go to the cons, where I struggle with Miek is, yeah, he's going to work in that deck, but is he going to be worth taking something out in that deck? And that's where I struggle, because there's already 1-drops in discard lists that are pretty popular right now that are doing a bit of a better job, or at least require less support. And that's stuff like Nebula, for instance. Blade is actually a discard activator, helping the deck list a bunch. And then Black Knight's another one that's been run recently. He does require quite a bit of support, but has a lot more power upside in the right deck. So I just find it a bit difficult to warrant actually putting Miek in. And then you could look at Morbius, who only costs one more, gets more power output, and doesn't have to be on the board at any specific time. And I start to wonder if I would just rather Morbius over Miek. Or maybe both, but then you gotta watch out with what you're fitting your deck with. So anyways, I see the power upside, but I think that, discard's a little bit too tightly built. It's already a pretty packed list. And if I was to go a step further, I think there's going to be a lot of discard synergy cards coming out in February that are going to make it even harder to warrant keeping Miek in your deck list. He might be the first one cut despite just getting him in January, which is like where I'm like, I don't know if I want to spend the resources on a card that I'm going to cut from his main list next month. But time will tell. We don't know if those cards are going to be good or not, so maybe there's hope for Miek yet. Another fun little factor with this card is the movement. I don't think it's a huge factor, but it does play a little bit of mind games with the opponent. If you discard a card on turn 6, Miek is going to move, and if he has 5-6 power, that is an unpredictable amount of power being placed at a different location. It could backfire because maybe you really needed that power at Miek's location, and any discard you do is guaranteed to move him off unless a location, or both locations rather, are full, which it gets a little bit dicey, but it could also just trick your opponent. One thing I missed with Blob is that a great strength of Blobs is your opponent doesn't know how much power they have to compensate out of location to beat you as the Blob player, and usually they just can't output enough power to beat the Blob. Miek isn't nearly on the same level of scaling, but he does have that factor of surprising the opponent if he skitters over to a different location where maybe you were losing, and then he gives you that enough power to get over that location and get a win over there. So there's an interesting element to his movement, but it is RNG and it could backfire. So it goes both ways. Anyways, he seems like a fun little guy, but if you don't want to pick up this card, how do you counter him? Well, I'm not going to lie, unless I'm missing some really obvious ones, I don't think there's a whole lot that counters him besides some very obvious cards that are unfortunately quite popular right now. So Kingpin was recently changed to give -2 power when a card moves to his location. If you happen to discard, 2-3 turns in a row, there's a good shot that your Miek is going to fall into the Kingpin trap and get that -2 power, which is the whole point of Miek. You're trying to build up that power, so that's going to feel really bad. What would even feel worse if you're not running Kyera and you don't have a way of protecting Miek. Killmonger can snipe this little guy, no problem. And Elektra could too. Elektra is not nearly as popular, but she can destroy Miek if she has a priority and your opponent flips first. They'll get that Miek no problem. Another one is Shadow King, because this is given power. It's not permanent power or anything like that. Well, actually, impermanent power can be reduced. It's such a weird little terminology thing. But Shadow King, nonetheless, can take away the bonus power that Miek is getting from his ability, which sucks. And then the last two I have there is Kraven and Cosmo. Now, Kraven is, you're probably thinking, what are you talking about here, Drew? You can use Kraven with Miek, but he's reciprocal. So if your opponent is playing Kraven and your Miek's fallen into the opponent's Kraven trap, then they're just getting bonus power. But of course, we could use Kraven on our end. It's going to be great. So it goes both ways on that with that card. And lastly, Cosmo. I feel like I always got Cosmo here, but ultimately, all the discard cards, at least 90% of them, are on reveals. And if they don't get their activation off, then Miek's not going to get his activation off. So if Cosmo shuts down the discard, then he's shutting down Miek as well, which is pretty nasty. So those are some of the counters that I was thinking about. But let's look at some of the cards that are coming out in the near future that can maybe help this little guy out find a home. Well, they might help, or they might just bump him out of his own deck. We'll find out. But you got Corvus Glaive here coming out in February. I'm very excited about this card. A lot of people are kind of thinking it's overrated because discard doesn't need the energy, but I think it's mostly because we haven't had an energy card that works very well with discard, and this one just works out beautifully because you want to discard cards from your hand. So Corvus has a good stat line, good discarding, and gets you max energy. It just seems like a lot of upside to me, and if he discards 2 cards from your hand while Miek is on the board. That's +2 power for Miek, and happy days, more energy, more ways hopefully to discard later in the game, and you're just going to pop off and have a crazy strong little Miek. Another one is Black Swan. I don't know if a list would ever actually spawn with this, but it still warrants consideration because Black Swan is on reveal until the end of next turn. Your 1-cost cards cost 0, making Miek a 0 cost. Maybe you pair that with like Blade and Black Knight or something like that, and you play a bunch of these 1 costs with only Infinite in your hand, and then you end up with a decently sized Miek. You get a Ebony Blade that is like a 420, and it's you're off to the races from there. So maybe there's like a crazy Black Swan discard list brewing up, which would be a lot of fun. Anyways, those are some that stood out to me for synergies with Miek, and they're both coming out in February. In fact, Black Swan is the season pass card, which is pretty exciting. So time will tell if that works out for them. Moving on to some of the key synergies and deck lists that I have brewed up for you guys here today. So I think synergies are pretty obvious. Your biggest discards are MODOK, Hellcow. They discard the most cards from your hand. Kyra is going to protect Miek. Miles Morales, because Miek is moving around, then it becomes a 1/5. Pretty easy activator there, although I've never seen a move discard hybrid, and I didn't even take a shot at one because I don't think it'll work or exist. But then there's also Craven synergies. But yeah, I don't think move discard is quite there just yet. But hey, prove me wrong. I'd love to play that deck. That sounds like a lot of fun. But the decks I have are classic discard, so nothing to really see here other than a very staple discard list that focuses on playing Dracula, then MODOK, and then APOC, so that you essentially only have APOC in your hand by the end of the game, and then Dracula discards it, gets all that power. And what we're trying to do is just discard a lot of cards so that Miek can get to decent power totals. Of course, that Dracula is not going to work with Miek, but just about everything else in this deck is going to work pretty smoothly. So I like that list a lot. I think if I'm going to pick up Miek, I would start there. The next list is, well, when you give me an opportunity to talk about a knight that's a bug, I'm going to call it Hollow Knight. Let's go. The best game of all time. But here we have Hollow Knight. So I don't know if I love this home for Miek. I've been playing a very similar list to this to great success. It's been a lot of fun, actually, using Black Knight, Zabu to discount the Ebony Blade, and then Ghost Rider to bring out back whatever card you discarded, and Kyra to protect it all. It works, but does it work for Miek? Because there's not a lot of discard activators here. I think in total I've got 3, Hellcow discarding 2, which means our total power upside for Miek, provided there's no location help or no help from our opponent, would be 5. You'd have a 1/5 if we played Blade, Lady Sif, and Hellcow after Miek. I don't think that's worth it, but I wanted to explore it nonetheless. And then the last one that I have here is a crazy list, but I used to run this all the time. It's a pretty good budget list for a lot of folk, maybe in Series 3, and that is the Miek guy. So the idea here is you use Strong Guy, you put him on the board, he's a 3/3, but then by the turn 6, if we've got Sarah out there, all these cards are going to be playable. And you can play them with Hit Monkey and all these discard cards so that by the end of the game, we have no cards in our hand and Strong Guy gets his buff. The upside to a deck like this is that a lot of these cards naturally have high power totals for low cost. So we kind of make use of just really doing a big burst of power through our card's base power and augmenting our Strong Guy, and then hopefully getting Miek a decent amount of power, and our opponent's really not going to know where we hit them. It's going to be a very widespread board power burst. So those are some of the decks that I brewed up, but really when I was looking at decks to build with Miek, unless I'm just being short-sighted, I think that classic discard is really the only path for Miek in my mind. He's very narrow in his application. The whole Hela thing, it's not going to work out because of the end of game condition with Miek's mechanics. So does that mean Miek is a snap or a pass? I really don't like doing this. I like to provide a verdict even if I'm wrong or if I'm right. But in this instance, because Miek is a Series 4 card and fits a very specific archetype that I'm sure a lot of folks love, I can't really say pass on this card. I think he's going to do well in discard lists, but that's about where it ends. And he also might be replaceable later on. So that's where I'm thinking, if you don't have a lot of resources, don't break the bank for Miek. You can replace him with like Morbius or some other things, and your deck is probably going to perform at a similar rate that deck would have performed with Miek. So that's where I'm a little hesitant to say buy it or pass on it. Ultimately, a card like this is more about what you like to play. If you like discard, you have all the cards for discard, you want to add to that list and just add more options to have fun with, then I think this is actually a very fun, very interesting card to put in those decks. But otherwise, it's an easy pass if you're not too interested in it, and especially in the Spotlight Cache department. If you own a Nihilist, I would definitely pass on opening Spotlight Caches. Use your tokens on these two cards if you feel that you need to, if you really want to. But if you don't have a Nihilist, then maybe it's worth rolling. Again, it comes down to your collection, your resources. You got to manage them efficiently. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope this was really helpful. If it was, subscribe to the channel. We do this every single week with every brand new card. Try to get out as much info as I can. I don't always get the verdict right, but you know, it's a preview. We never really know how these cards are going to perform until they hit the game, which Miek is going to be coming soon. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.